Ms Mitchell.
Mr Gove, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID Bereaved. I would like to take you back to a Cabinet meeting on the 20th, in July 2020. Now, by this time, the first wave was over, the second wave was still to come. And this inquiry has heard evidence that there was no pandemic plan, about the dysfunctionality in those critical months before July, infighting, misogyny, failure to understand science, maths, graphs, dithering, trolleying, all resulting in a deadly delay before implementing lockdown. It's against the background of these 4 months into the pandemic that you present a paper at a meeting of the Cabinet on the 21st July 2020 called State of the Union. If I can have inquiry number 89054 up on screen, particularly paragraph 2. Do you recognise this document?
Yes.
Is that a document written by you?
It would have been written by my team.
And did you present this document at the Cabinet meeting?
Yes, I think, if I can go back, did you say that it was the 12th of July or the 20th of July?
It was the 21st July 2020. It's the front page will show.
OK, yeah.
Now, at paragraph 2, we see that a comment is made that in Scotland only 27% of people think the UK government is putting in place the right measures, but 70% of the respondents believe the Scottish government, 27% believe that the UK government is putting in place the right measures, 70% believe the Scottish government is putting in place the right measures. If we can move on to page 5, please, the top paragraph, which is available. That should be on your screen. It says, we need to change perceptions of our response to COVID-19. There is a real opportunity to outline how being part of the Union has significantly reduced the hardships faced by individuals and businesses across the UK and will continue to do so. And then it notes that satisfaction with the government is low. You've said, building on the work of Treasury, we need to generate further tangible examples where we have acted in the interests of citizens from all across 4 nations, and all departments should review their COVID-19 responses to identify examples that could be utilised in future communications. Now, in your answer to Mr Keith's question posed earlier, you expressed the view that the Scottish Government, being led by a political party that has a desire to generate at particular points causes for grievance or objection to the UK government's constitution. And you also said if there was an opportunity additionally to make a political point, that temptation was here. From this document, it appears that you are suggesting that the UK government considers that the pandemic was an opportunity to emphasise the strength of the Union, that you were suggesting that a political point could be made. Was it in fact the UK government playing politics with the pandemic response? So what I wish to pose to you was whether or not what you were trying to get across there was political in terms. You were wanting to emphasise the strength of the Union. Can I move on to question 2, please? The First Minister of Scotland was asked to express her opinion on your view that devolution arrangements didn't lend themselves to an obvious mechanism to bring the devolved administrations into the decision-making process. Now, we don't need her response up for speed of time, but what she says is she agrees there wasn't a pre-existing mechanism. However, she says the problem in her view was not the lack of the mechanism, but the difficulty the UK government had in treating the devolved administrations as equal partners. As long as they see, to quote the former Prime Minister, as optically wrong, they will not be prepared to deploy the flexibility necessary to make any mechanism work effectively. Now, this inquiry has heard evidence from those at the heart of government that COBRA meetings attended by the First Minister were Potemkin in nature, a charade carried out to give the impression that the Scottish Government were involved in the decision-making process, whilst decisions were taken elsewhere in secretive meetings. What I want to ask you is, firstly, Do you agree that the UK government had difficulty in treating Scotland as equal partners in the crisis?
No.
Did you show that by making decisions which were taken elsewhere and not within COBRA?
No.
Was the UK government prepared to deploy the flexibility necessary to make the mechanisms work effectively?
Yes.
In doing so, can I ask, in what way, when we've heard specifically that decisions were taken elsewhere and presented at COBRA as a fait accompli, and the devolved administrations were asked whether or not they agree to that, was treating people or treating the devolved administrations as equal partners and also deploying the flexibility to make their mechanism, their ability to input into those decisions work effectively?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, certainly. What way did the UK government show that they were treating Scotland as equal partners and deploying the flexibility necessary to make any mechanism work effectively in circumstances where decisions were being taken out with COBRA and being brought to COBRA as if those decisions were still to be made to allow the devolved administrations to agree? Mr Gove, I'm moving on to my third question. You have highlighted, in your view, the importance of clarity in respect of the public health message. You've also highlighted, in response to one of my learned friends, that one of the concerns that was being expressed to you, that there was a risk or danger that the need for coherent UK-wide communications could be vitiated or compromised by some in the devolved administrations moving to the microphones before others, as it were. That was your response. This inquiry has had the opportunity to consider an expert report from Professor Ailsa Henderson, inquiry number 269372. I wonder if I can have up page 49, paragraphs 151 and 152. Now, this is an analysis of the UK government's public health response. And do we see about 3/4 of the way down paragraph 151? An analysis of the text-prepared speeches through 2020 shows those that, speaking on behalf of the UK government, did an incomplete job of outlining the territorial scope of data, information or guidance. And it goes on to talk about the fact there was no mention of the first ministers of the devolved administrations. Moving on to paragraph 152, about 3 or 4 lines down, it explains that when ministers were giving messages, more typically they outlined the guidance for England alone, but that the devolved administrations would offer their own guidance. It gives examples. Reference to reopening retail, which was England only, was made less clear by referring to the opening of British high streets. And on 23rd of June, Mr Johnson clarified that the measures applied to England only and then set out rules for the British public. What impact do you consider the UK government's use of UK to mean England had on the Scottish public's perception of the UK government's response to the pandemic?
I think at best marginal. I think that people across the United Kingdom would have had a pretty clear understanding of the different responsibilities of their governments.
So that when the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom refers to rules only for England and then advises that these are rules to follow for the British public, the people in Scotland would be aware that that didn't apply to them?
I think that people in Scotland were very well aware that there were, later in the response to the pandemic, different approaches in Scotland. I think the fact that the First Minister had a daily press conference would have meant that there was pretty clear communication. Again, I think that a critical question here is, as Professor Henderson and others have pointed out, the fact that the UK government is both responsible for issues in England and also has UK-wide responsibilities as well. That is not entirely unique, but it is certainly a specific constitutional arrangement. Within that, I think that the need for the best possible and most coherent communication, of course, is important, but as we touched on earlier, there can sometimes be a tension. And the tension that I mentioned was a tension between that clarity of hands, face, space and the credibility, adduced earlier, of the Scottish Government. So how do you decide between a clear UK-wide message, which is more effective, or a Scottish Government message which is less effective, but which is being conveyed by a more credible advocate?
Would you agree that the duty of the UK Government was to provide information which was clear to everybody within the United Kingdom, making clear what the rules were in Scotland and the rules were in other parts of the UK, and that was the most critical factor?
It was certainly an important factor, but I would also say that at different times there was confusion. I myself remember being interrogated at different times about, as questions I mentioned earlier, like whether or not a Scotch egg was a substantial meal. The reason why we needed to refine messaging is that decisions were often being made by different administrations at pace. But more broadly, I would characterise the approach both of the UK government and the devolved administrations as one of effective functioning collaboration. One can home in on someone mixing up the phrase English and British at one time. But if that is the gravamen of a charge of high-handedness on the part of the UK government, then I would argue that is, as considering the matters with which this inquiry has to deal, perhaps not the most significant.
Mr Gove, the expert witness simply says there was little attempt to outline what applied to the UK-wide and what applied only to England. The phrase "this country" was employed frequently to mean England or Great Britain or the UK. There wasn't clarity in the UK government's handling of this matter. My lady, I've got no further questions.
Well, can I just say that...
I think you've answered that question. Thank you very much, Mr Gove. Thank you, Ms Mitchell.